Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Leather with the Center for Innovation and Education, or CIE. We're a small national educational consulting group focused on supporting the creation of more equity-seeking education systems at the local, state, and federal level. We're really glad that you've been able to join us today. We're going to share with you some learnings we've had in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, where the Kentucky Department of Education is looking to change the game of assessment and accountability in a truly profound way. I'm going to share some slides to give you some context for their work, and then we will have a discussion as to learnings with our team. We are very fortunate to be joined for this session today. First off, another member of our team, Gretchen Morgan, our managing partner. And really pleased that David Cook, the Director of Innovation for the Kentucky Department of Education, who really oversees all of the many parts of this project in Kentucky, and his partner in crime, Sarah Snipes, the Innovative Strategies Manager at the department, who supports the Kentucky Innovative Learning Network and the local laboratories of learning at KDE. Both really are the architects / engineers of this work at the Kentucky Department of Education. I don't know, Gretchen or David or Sarah, would you like to say anything before we get started?
Nope. Paul, I would take a little bit of step back a little bit from architect, and we're going to hear a lot about that today, about the fact that what makes this work so powerful is that it was the local communities that are the architects. We could possibly be called engineers, but the great thing about this work for me, the most important thing, is that it's been co-created with local stakeholders, and not something that KDE has done to people. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. That's a good context setter. Sarah, anything you'd like to add?
I would just echo that, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon.
Okay. In terms of this session, our goals are to share how we are thinking about liberatory design and radical inclusion as ways to build unlikely partners and to build trust across the system. Those of you who may have attended Donnie Tran and Audrey Gilbert and Penny Christian's session in the one preceding this, you had a good opportunity to really look at and dive into inclusive design. We're going to talk a little bit more about it in terms of the larger system, but we will touch on inclusive co-creation and how it can support and is supported by the practice of the 4 habits: inclusion, empathy, co-creation, and reciprocity. And we'll also share how this kind of a process has developed in Kentucky and is continuing to develop with the architects at the local level, right, David? So here is a slide, and we will be using a few of the same slides from that session, but we'll be addressing them differently. This is a slide that was developed by Jenny Poon, who's on this call, that talks a little bit about how we see the larger ecosystem. It's really a heat map, if you will, of the power and relative relationships in 2 kinds of systems. The one on the left is a traditional state and local education system, if you will, and the one on the right, one that practices the habits I just mentioned. The key difference on the right is this idea of co-creation with local communities. In most public education systems that we have today in this country, educational experts are consulted to design a system that is then rolled out and rolled down the levels of the system, from the federal Department of Education often, to the states, to districts, to schools, and ultimately, finally, to teachers, students, and parents. The assumption is that experts know better how to do things like measure learning or drive improvement than do those directly involved with the learning process. And while expertise is crucial, this approach badly misreads how complex human systems actually work and what truly drives learning and improvement. And our work at CIE, we are learning that expertise should be plural, and that if the primary viewpoint you're consulting is only from those at the top of the system, you will create solutions that at best only work at the top, and perhaps not even there, as there are assumptions made about the larger system that, if not truly tested all through the system, may not hold true in terms of helping to identify ways of improving the system overall. And on top of that reality, if the top-down perspective embeds racist assumptions at its core, racism will permeate throughout the system. But what if those holding decision-making authorities saw themselves as partners in getting it right alongside the very communities they serve? What if they set out to marshal the collective wisdom and capabilities of diverse actors across the whole system to find emerging solutions, plural, not singular? This is what we mean by co-creation with communities. This is what we think can lead to inclusive community accountability as both means and ends for addressing the system inequities that our current system is built on. So when we have a system that is built on a liberatory design process with radical inclusion as a core tenet, then we see better products in that they are built to address the needs of the actual users of the system. We see improved communication, as also core to the process is the idea that concerns are transparent and addressed together. We see deeper commitment, particularly on the part of stakeholders who heretofore have often been shut out of the decision-making process. We see greater sustainability, as this kind of a process naturally creates a kind of public will from the ground up of those who are deeply engaged in its success. And ultimately, we see expanded trust in that if I do things in relation to your needs and you reciprocally act in response, this can only help to build trust and understanding of different perspectives. Please know that we have not been working on this in Kentucky only, but CIE has also worked in communities like Burlington, Vermont, and with networks like the Deeper Learning Dozen, and with groups and communities across a number of other states, Colorado, North Dakota, Georgia, New Hampshire, and New Mexico, to name a few. While we use a design process to develop a solution to the problem of our communities identify, we are grounding ourselves in 4 habits of co-creation. It is our hypothesis that in working, let's go one more slide if we could, as an inclusive community that actively grounds ourselves in these habits, we have the ability to transform our local system, making it more accessible and engaging for a wider range of stakeholders. We all start with one habit and then deepen our efforts to include the rest. We focus on these 4 habits in the first part of the design cycle, and we return to them even after we design our initial solution, ever going deeper with the habits, making them truly the way we interact and do business. Inclusive design is a set of moves that have been put together in ways that are supported by the practice of the 4 habits. And they are really best suited for design work where you've had the time to think and reflect deeply as sense makers, where you find yourself in a creative mode, and when you will have multiple cycles of reciprocal feedback and co-creation. Please take a minute or 2 and put in the chat, have you used these habits in your work? Is there an opportunity in your context for utilizing habits you have not used before? What would it look like in your context? Gretchen, I'm starting to see some come in the,
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. It looks like a couple of folks referring to student inclusion of student voice as one of the sort of steps here where they've integrated that into their work. And then Roman, I'm seeing your note about having done some work with inclusion, empathy, and co-creation, but not sure you've made it to reciprocity yet. John Blumenfield has made a note here that the National Youth Leadership Council supports educators and out-of-school time professionals with including young people in their decision-making processes. Some authentic young adult partnerships and using inclusive design as they co-create youth advisory councils with partners. It's great. Oh yeah, seeing your note, Karen. All too often working with administrators who might want to move too quickly. Co-creation takes time. That can be really annoying if you're used to being the person who has all the answers and can give people directions. That's tricky. Rhett from OSPI, using these with schools to understand the impacts of state actions, I'm assuming, on their local systems, their staff and students, what complexities you didn't plan for or anticipate in implementation. So great. Well, as you all keep going in the chat, I'm just going to share a little bit about the process that we undertook in Kentucky with the KCAE, Kentucky Coalition for Advancing Education, which was a statewide group formed in ways that were different in terms of how inclusive it was. It was a statewide coalition of folks that included certainly local educators and district educators and state educators, but also included students, also included family members, also included local community leaders and some elected officials. And this group came together. If you were in the other session this morning, you heard from some of them directly. But they came together and didn't just form a representative group themselves, but as you can see in this diagram that we're going to flow through on the next couple of slides, the first thing they did actually was engage in empathy processes with other folks. So they reached out to a group much larger than themselves and with an explicit interest in making sure they were reaching out to folks more on the margins of our public education systems, whoever that was in the different communities that our KCA members were a part of. So they started with empathy interviews, and then we worked together to create a set of user profiles. And we built profiles based off of sort of patterns of needs identified. So there were student profiles built to try and capture sort of patterns and themes across the number of students we talked to, sometimes including unique perspectives because they were outliers that seemed important. So it isn't just those things that came up most often. The same for families, the same for teachers, the same for school and district leaders, and the same for community members, really creating profiles that gathered the current sort of sets of experiences by gathering quotes from empathy interviews to put together, as well as what we identified to be the sort of compelling needs of these folks, insights they had about how the system worked and compelling needs they had. And we put that together into a set of shared themes as we started to move toward a report together. And we ended up taking those shared themes as well as themes per individual type of user or participant in the Kentucky education system and gathered those together into the current state of Kentucky, and really a good summary and synthesis of what is true across the state right now. Well, a year from now, or a year back, because we did it a year ago. And then a future aspirational vision. And we captured aspirations by user type as well as those that were sort of collective and shared, which has turned out to be really useful. And all of that was summarized and pulled together into this report, the United We Learn report, which was a pretty big deal, I think, for us at the time, because it's one of the only times we know about where a state agency has really sponsored work this collective to set direction for a department and for a state. And yeah, I'm about to share the report in the chat. You're reading my mind, Roman. Hang on, here's the link to that. And I think is a really good example of, we didn't just sort of hear from folks and then write this report. There was a lot of reciprocity in how this report even was created. Members of the community helped drafting sections of it. you know, us trying to figure out and clean up things and taking it back to them. In the final stages, even like small word choices, going back to community members who'd worked on portions of the report to make sure that in our desire to edit for clarity, we weren't somehow mistaking their words and their perceptions of things. And so it is a really beautiful example of a thing that can be produced when you really do commit to co-creation. I'll move now to this slide for you, Paul.
Thank you, Gretchen. So to start the process of building the larger system, David and Sarah really enlisted ultimately 18 Kentucky districts and their leaders to be designated local laboratories of learning, or L3s as David calls them. And that really caught on, I might say. Some of which we'll share with you in a second. Subsequently, other L3 districts joined, and they each have created their own inclusive coalitions and examined the issues related to the current state and what their future state could look like. Just a month ago, the state was awarded a multi-year, multi-million-dollar competitive grant for state assessments from the U.S. Department of Education to build a new state assessment and accountability system tied to competency-based education, and also to create a sustaining infrastructure to drive change across the state, including the establishment of the Kentucky United We Learn Council to pick up the mantle of the Kentucky Coalition of Advancing Education. But before we leave this slide, let me just say that all of this is really based on this idea of reciprocal accountability, reciprocity between the school district and the school and the community, really centering on community needs, as well as reciprocity between the state and the district. And we know that sometimes those things don't look exactly the same. And so often we end up with assessment and accountability systems that don't feel very coherent. And so we believe, and I believe that David and Sarah believe, that so much of the work that we're involved in is right in the center of this slide, this idea of reciprocal accountability and how can we bring it all together. So now I'd like to ask David and Sarah to join and to make some opening comments about the project overall and share what it has been like to form the KCAE, the local L3s, and now the United We Learn Council from their perspective, leading the overall process of KDE. David, do you want to start? And this is the here.
Yeah, these are L3s. A pretty diverse group of districts within our state, including our largest school district, the Jefferson County Public Schools, with about 100,000 kids, and a couple of our smallest, Frankfort Independent being one of our under 1,000 student districts. So yeah, we'll go on to I think we can go on to the next slide. I don't know if, but yeah, as Paul was saying, I've been at this agency for longer than I care to remind myself, sometimes over 25 years. And I have never seen us create, build a vision in the way that we've built this vision, and build a initiative or a set of initiatives around a vision the way we've built this one. As Paul demonstrated in an earlier slide, many times we do a lot of top-down work at the state agency. And from the moment that he arrived in Kentucky, our commissioner, Jason Glass, this was what he wanted to do. He wanted to build something from the outside in, if you will. So from the get-go, the very first element of this whole process was listening tours across the state during the pandemic, virtual listening tours, in which we gathered thousands of pieces of data from local community members about the future of education in Kentucky. And it was pretty simple if you really think about the questions. They were complex to answer, but the questions were basically, what was the system like for you, or is like for you now if you're a student, and how do you think it ought to be different in the future? And all of that, to Gretchen and Paul's points, both leading into this discussion, brought us to the United We Learn report and a vision for Kentucky, the future of education in Kentucky, that was community-based, community-driven, and reciprocal in nature. And we'll talk a lot more about that in just a minute. But it embedded the elements that we've already described here of empathy, co-creation, inclusion, and reciprocity. And it's just been, to me, what sets it apart from just about anything we've ever done, and I'm sure most things that your states might have done, in that it's truly has the opportunity to create something that's sustainable because it's localized, and it has that reciprocity element at its heart. So Sarah, I'm probably leaving out quite a few things that you're thinking about. So
I think that captures a lot of it, David. I think I've been pretty closely in tune with our L3 communities specifically, and something that was really elevated in our local coalitions as they were developed through this work, to really be the vehicles to drive local design and inform our state system. It was really powerful to ask those communities, those district leaders, to think about a strong community partner to walk alongside them in this work. And that built such a strong and necessary bridge between education systems and the larger community. So I always like to elevate that piece because it truly has grounded our folks who live in a world of education, and even break down barriers to language and what we mean when we say assessment and accountability. Those folks really hold their teams accountable to think about how they're reaching folks in their community whose backgrounds may not be in education professionally, but certainly are those key users in the system. So just some really powerful partnerships that have gone a long way to building and expanding trust across the state. And now we have a really great network of champions who are mobilizing and really pushing for this work on their own across these communities and back up to the state.
yeah, and we, neither one of us actually dove deep into, and we won't spend a lot of time on the actual process, which is one of the most powerful pieces of the initial design of this, thanks to our friends at CIE, was this radically inclusive design out process for coming up with first the Kentucky Coalition for Advancing Education, and then the local L3s, and now the United We Learn Council, which is the sort of the vehicle that's going to take us even farther, is this idea of, you know, traditionally in our work, and I'm sure in many of your work, you selected, if you wanted to have a task force or a coalition or something, you just sort of select people. And you might get a diverse group, and you might get all the stakeholders represented, but it's not guaranteed that you would. So we did this process at all these levels in the same way. We sort of said, okay, first of all, who do we need to have? We know we have to have. So kind of the group that KDE sort of identified. And that became superintendents from our local labs and some other folks, legislators, state board members, people like that. Then we took another third of the group, which is this is for this Coalition on Advancing Education, 60 people. The second third was by application. So we just sent an application out to the world and said, you know, you're invited to apply to be a part of this coalition. And we got 20 members through application. And then the last third was truly the part that we then kind of looked back over everything and said, you know what? We need to find this person. We're missing this particular voice at the table. And we went out and secured those people that were not being represented. And the result was a coalition of people more diverse than our state is, which was pretty powerful. And then that same process, as Sarah was explaining it just now, that's the powerful part is that same process was used by each of these local labs to identify their coalition and to specifically identify a partner from the community. So this wasn't about a school district inviting the community to sort of participate in this process. It was a coalition of people all focused with leadership from the community and the district on this process.
So that's great. I think maybe we could drill in down a little bit more into the idea of empathy. And I'm wondering, David and Sarah, whether you could talk a little bit about, with the KCAE, there were several themes that really emerged that are represented in the report that came out of the empathy process that the KCAE and was involved in, as well as the listening tour that David referenced earlier. Can you talk a little bit about what was revealed through that process?
Sarah, you want to start that
Sure.
conversation?
Yeah, so we took a look through empathy interviews. Of course, you have some great qualitative data, right, that was brought up from those interviews. So we started looking at quotes by users, really digging into why some highlighted quotes for coalition members were so important, and then gleaning from that, what are the compelling needs of this user, and what are some insights that we're gathering. And so from there, in the report that I see Gretchen has linked in the chat, you will see a breakdown of 10 themes. There are, in the L3 process, we asked local teams to realize that while these themes are representative of what we heard across the Commonwealth, we understood that a lot of the work centered around the unique context of each community. And so we asked our local teams to go back out into their communities and continue that empathy process to really refine those profiles as they exist in their own community. So understanding that we would see those experiences and perspectives represented widely across our state, but knowing we may need to fine tune those to really get an understanding of how the work is playing out in our own context. And so that was really asking folks to dive back out into their communities to gather additional voices, really helped our teams identify which themes were hotspots, if you will, for the work that they wanted to act on in their community. And so just from that report, if you do not have it open, as I mentioned, 10 current state themes were created by the KCAE, and then those were paired with a future vision. So where are we, but where do we want to go? Those range from the need to respond to inequity in a systemic way, recognizing our communities as unique, with unique people and as places. We also had communities thinking about making assessments go beyond a snapshot of a whole child and reflecting what communities need to do to cultivate learning. When we actually sent these themes back out into our L3 communities, that theme in particular seemed to resonate with many of the members of local teams as well.
Thank you. And so there's this one question I find interesting. What is taking time to empathize done for the members of these processes? How has that impacted their connection to what they are hearing in terms of voices from the community?
I think it's been extremely powerful, Paul, because I think we don't often take time to do that in any process, planning process, design process. Normally, we don't do that. We may ask some very high level questions or superficial questions, but we don't really spend the time to find out about the others that are part of our community and what their thinking is. One of the things about this that isn't easy is that it takes time. Often we, in education, because we are coming out of a pandemic and we're trying to get test scores back up and we're trying to work on different things about learning is we don't take the time to really find out why we want this to change and who is involved in that change. And the empathy interview process does that. It allows us to hear everybody's voice and that voice be about what they are thinking, not questions that sort of guide them into answers, but tell me what you think, tell me what you feel, tell me what you're thinking about this work. That's been powerful, and it's changed the way the work is working. And it also changes in a much larger sense than this particular work. It changes the way the district makes decisions, because it asks people different questions than it would ask before. So it now is going to become a normal course of action when a district is trying to think about something they want to do, to conduct empathy interviews so they know really if this is right, the thing they need to do. Does this match with what our community wants us to do? So,
David, I would just add on there very briefly. It's also, it's forced us as an agency, but also our district leaders to challenge those assumptions, to
Yep.
David's point, right? One of our communities thought they knew their next step, but that assumption was challenged by what they heard from their community, and they were able to be responsive and pivot to meet those needs. And so I also wanted to raise up that in the KCAE and in our local communities, we've been encouraged to welcome those challengers in, right? Like welcome the voices who will challenge and who may not have been a champion alongside you in a journey in the past, right? And what we found through the empathy process specifically is it really kind of sees through the noise, right? And it really puts the focus on a collective voice rather than the individual. And so where you would perceive that conflicts would arise and thinking about what problems do we need to address and what solutions would we like to pursue, it really has helped shift that conversation to a much more productive, community-centered and driven approach.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that, Sarah, I think a thing that was really important in KCAE and is happening locally that you're tapping into here is that everybody who did an empathy interview with anybody else came to see that the sort of core issues were more complex than they first thought. Mm-hmm. And I think that causes people to be open to what you're describing, Sarah, which is thinking about this from more of a community perspective rather than I'm a person who's had a particular individual experience and I'm coming here to make sure you feel accountable to my individual experience and give me an individualized solution. Empathizing with others is a way to start thinking more about systems solutions and community-wide solutions. And I think we've seen that at all different levels in Kentucky, which I think it's pretty exciting. I mean, it makes me feel like the potential for solutions being really useful and really well sustaining is really high.
So John in the chat is kind of anticipating the next question, which is really the issue of co-creation. When I think about what I heard the three of you talking about relative to empathy, that deeper engagement in the issues that people are rising up really just creates an opportunity for co-creation, which is the next part of the process going forward. Can you talk a little bit, David and Sarah, about some examples of co-creation that you've seen both at the state and at the local level?
Yeah, I think the first example we've already mentioned on a couple of occasions today, which is the whole process of creating the United We Learn report. Mm-hmm. That to me is a true example of co-creation, because it was as Gretchen pointed out very early on today, it was an example of a group, this coalition, this group of people wrote this report. This was not a report that staff at the Department of Education wrote based on information they got from the stakeholders. The stakeholders wrote the report along with us and in terms of editing and things like that. But they sat through sessions and sessions about this information and created it. And I think what we're seeing, and Sarah can talk to this in a second when I finish, but I think we're seeing in decision making, to John's question, we're seeing local communities. Number one, they're redefining for themselves what accountability is. They're taking ownership of accountability at their level, and they're making decisions about what they want their learners to know and be able to do and have in a different way than living in the world of, well, it's just the test and that's what we have to live with. They're making a decision locally that that's not what we're going to live with. So we're going to change, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the conversation today, but that's what's really changing in our mindset at a state level about accountability. And the last piece of co-creation that I will say is that all of these same groups, these L3 groups, the coalition, and now the United We Learn Council have been a part of. So we were doing all this great work, and we had some ESSER money that was still floating around that could have been used to help with this, and it is, but we really needed a nice big funding source to help us really blow this thing out of the water. And that's where the CGSA grant, the competitive grant for state assessment, came into play. And we applied for that in the spring, again, in a very co-created kind of fashion. And that grant is going to allow us to really dive deeper into this United We Learn Council, and in looking at these prototypes, these things that these local laboratories of learning are doing. And that, John, leads to policy change, which, as you can imagine, it doesn't happen right alongside the decisions that locals are making, but those decisions that locals are making are informing how we're going to attack the idea of changing policy to create this more reciprocal kind of system that we want to have.
I distinctly remember one meeting, David, where a small planning group had started the CGSA grant writing process and then brought it to the larger larger KCAE group, and they said, "Well, wait a minute, I'm not sure you're focused on the right things here."
Yep.
And they sent the group back to address some other issues that they felt were more important, and that was a very distinct process of decision making, and we were able to cite that in the grant proposal that David put forward to the U.S. Department of Ed, and made a huge difference, right?
Yep, it absolutely did. Sarah, what else do you think about when you think about co-creation?
I'm thinking about Commissioner Glass. One of the things that he'll say time and time again is that we do not need to wait for permission to change the student experience. And so most immediately, to David's point, we've seen that co-creating with students, family members, teachers, local business owners, our districts are making very immediate shifts in support of other efforts happening in our state right now, as a statewide deeper learning grant initiative, project-based learning. They're really making immediate, and this goes in with reciprocity as well, shifts in the way that students are experiencing education in our schools because of what they're hearing from their communities. And I'm also thinking, again, the co-creation and also this next question with reciprocity. I think because of this work, we shifted something that our Board of Education was prioritizing, which was the development of a statewide portrait of a graduate. We were hearing from our first cohort of L3 communities that a competency-based system and thinking about a portrait of a learner was something that they were grappling with and creating with their communities. And so we saw that in response being prioritized by our State Board of Education. But I think what's most evident here is we perhaps formed a subcommittee for that work in a very different way. We asked a small subcommittee group to come in who had been involved in that statewide coalition. We had a group of a teacher, a student, a business owner was on that subcommittee voting on what that future statewide portrait will look like. And I think that is very different from how perhaps we would have created that together in the past because of this work.
Sarah, I'll just add one thing to that too, which is the board I think the state board did something that a lot of state boards do, which is they sensed that there was a lot of energy around local graduate profiles and thought we could help by creating a statewide one that folks could compare to and react to, and districts who haven't figured this out yet, this could be a help, to them moving forward. But their initial idea about how that would happen was, we will create a profile and it will be good. And now, not only did they use a more inclusive process that you described, Sarah, to build the profile itself, but also what they're planning to do in terms of sharing it and having people have the ability to customize it and react to it locally. Some of those things happened in reciprocity to feedback from the L3 districts as this was going on. And so I think it's a really good example, Sarah, of the state being responsive to feedback through a channel they didn't have before, and with much greater precision than maybe they would have before, to be in alignment with local priorities and local learning, and really things that actually had been co-created by local communities, right? Those local profiles were themselves evidence of local co-creation. Yeah. And so they were being more responsive to that. There've also been, like, just in the prototypes that the L3s have developed, they are co-creating in some cases, a really different dashboard that collects and shares different data about performance in their district than they were before. Maybe they were like on to the idea of a dashboard, but what's in there is becoming different. There's also folks in the L3s who decided in this work they needed to create a graduate profile, and then began to create like capstone projects. And the sort of approach and content of those projects is different than maybe it would have been before. So there's some like more granular, like you said, Sarah, practices are changing. There's like some local practices and policies that are also changing in response to what they're learning in these co-created processes.
And I to bring that, Gretchen, up to our level, and Sarah kind of inferred this, but we're doing decisions differently now. We're in a more reciprocal approach to the way we think about things, because because of ESSER and because of a lot of other things, we have some huge initiatives that we're just undergoing in Kentucky that are all connected to this work that the L3s have been doing, and they all have some interaction with assessment accountability. And there are things about deeper learning and about project-based learning. We have huge contracts now with PBL Works and with other things going on, and the way that we are supporting those things, and this is part of our CGSA grant at the department, we're using all of these things we're learning in the design process to rethink how we make decisions about coherence and about how we support districts to use all these things together, rather than, oh, over here's the L3 work and over here's this work and over here's this work. So I think reciprocity and I think it was Sarah a little while ago, one of the words that we don't list it as a habit, and I'm not sure it would be necessarily a habit, but a word that has become hugely important in this work is trust. And that's something we don't always have between school districts and the state. And that habit of trust, if you will, has become very, very powerful in this, that we believe in each other, and we believe that we're all focused on the same thing, which is to, as Sarah pointed out, to make learning experiences for students more vibrant and more real and more meaningful. And that's our goal with the United We Learn approach, all of us together working on it.
I'm wondering, in terms of co-creation, if maybe you could share some of the local prototypes that you're seeing starting to emerge. We've talked about portraits of a graduate, but there are some others that are kind of interesting. And these are ways in which these districts are thinking about accountability in a different way to get to the idea of, what kinds of different decisions are being made now as we start to build a new system.
Sarah, Sarah's usually can run them off the top of her head faster than I can, so.
It's fun though, as the work evolves. Of course, I mean, I say that knowing that this is still very much a living and breathing experience for our teams. They are, even our cohort that has been in this work the longest are still in that implementation, but testing and bringing that back to their coalition to refine that work. We have a few different prototype designs, and actually dropped in the chat. We made a video to kind of help share the work that has gone on with our first cohort. So for later viewing, that will actually walk you through our first 7 communities and what they are working on. We have one community that is working on student defense system while they're also aligning that to their emerging graduate profile work. We're also seeing, as we mentioned, the dashboards, the development of digital portfolios that highlight and tie specifically to career pathways and certifications. We also are working in communities around project-based capstone experiences. So we're seeing a lot of community-based accountability models. So we're looking at a wide range of student experiences. First and foremost is kind of how we've asked teams to think about this first. What is the problem that you're trying to solve for in your community, as it aligns to the 10 themes in the statewide report? But then also thinking about what is that solution first through kind of the student experience lens before building in the accountability and assessment piece as well.
And this starts to get at the comment from California that Roman put in the chat. One of the things I understand in the CGSA grant is to create a new system, David and Sarah, that is really a system of systems, right? Mm-hmm. And to create a policy that will allow for differences at the local level, but will still have elements of accountability that the state must address. Right. My sense is that there aren't all the answers for that yet and what that will look like, but it's a bold vision of what you're trying to accomplish.
Right, and it goes to your, I'm going to jump on your last question here, Paul, because I think that's what we're focusing on now, and that's what the grant language is talking about. And when we think about policy change, I think we often think about changing accountability, and it's really just a conversation about maybe a different way of testing or a different approach to testing and assessment, which will give us, in essence, a similar accountability structure at the end of the day. And what we're trying to do here is think about and talk about this idea of reciprocity as it relates to accountability is thinking about it in a different way, because what we're doing, because when you think about reciprocity, you're thinking about everybody in that conversation being valued. Well, we don't have that right now. And I doubt any of your states have that, which is there's a state accountability system that is 100% the value, and the state values it and the feds value it. Local accountability is not valued in the current structures that we have. The idea that we're really starting to really play into is, to Paul's point, is a system of systems is one in which we still have a big value put on the state federal accountability thing, and it has a lot of the weight. But what happens if we give value and ownership to those local accountability measures to the local districts? And that becomes a big piece of reciprocity. We value both sides of the coin, and we achieve two things. We achieve something that requires us to meet certain requirements and also is standardized. But then we also say, in this community, these things are also of value to us. And one of the parts that we don't have today is they can value it all they want to locally, but there's always that little piece that says, but nobody else values it. Well, why don't we start to become reciprocal with our communities and say, we value what you think is important in your community. In addition to, we're gonna measure these standards just like we always have, but tell us what it is you want to be held accountable for. That, Paul, has been one of the greatest conversations early on in this, is really, really having a different conversation about that word, accountability, and how it changes, and it's changing for us about what it means to be held accountable, and asking a local community and a local coalition, what do you want to be held accountable for? And listening back to them, asking, that's a different part of the empathy process, but it's saying, we're not just gonna blow smoke. We're gonna say, what is it that you want to be held accountable for? And that trust, that habit of trust, becomes very important in that conversation, because then you have people who believe that you trust them. And then that in turn leads to more powerful, meaningful, and real, authentic changes for students and their learning experiences. So that's at the heart of, I think, where we're going and where these prototypes and all of these things are leading us, is how do we create that value for those local communities in accountability, so that there's not just, it's not just another instance of the state saying, yeah, we want to help you think about a new way of doing accountability. But at the end of the day, it's all going to come back to this test, and that's going to be 100% of the deal. And so there's no value in what you're doing. So good luck with that.
Yeah, forgive me for using this analogy that I'm going to cite, but it's a little like the state test is like the one ring that will rule them all, right, David?
Yep.
And, folks are just really tired of that, and there's so much more that they're looking for in their communities, and so what you're trying to do is really try to give voice to what they're trying to accomplish, and trying to create policy that would support different ways of looking at accountability based on what their needs are and what they're seeing. I wondering if we could just talk just a little bit more about the state portrait of a learner. We already know that there's some concerns and fears and maybe a little edginess around in the field about, okay, so the Kentucky Board of Education has established a portrait of a learner. So what does that mean for us, right? Is that going to be the one ring that rules them all? What are you thinking in terms of reciprocity as you go into these conversations, David and Sarah?
Yeah, I think that, Paul, I think that the biggest thing with regard to the portrait of a learner is the intention of the state portrait of a learner is to say, we've looked at all of these portraits that districts either have or are developing. And at the end of the day, and this is probably true of 90%, 95% probably of the portraits across the country, they all end up landing on the same set of competencies, at least at a central place. There's usually 5 to 6 that you could see on every single portrait. Many have more than that. Many have a different approach to them. But at the end of the day, what we know to be true, because we started this process about 4 years ago with portraits that had already been developed by local districts in Kentucky. So it's not like we're taking something that is foreign to these folks. What I hope that we're going to present to them, and that they'll, when they see what we're going to do, is that they're going to see that we're simply saying, we believe these competencies, and there's 6 of them, to be really important for all students to have. I'm going to guess that most of them are going to take that, lay it against their own portrait of a learner, portrait of a graduate, and find they're very aligned. So there really isn't a question of the state's going to make me do theirs. And then the other thing that the state can do is, in the reciprocal part, is to lend value to the local portrait by providing help, resources with the things that are going to come next. Because what do we know is true? A lot of people have portraits, but they haven't operationalized them. We have done some work at the state level in Kentucky with the 6 competencies that we have developed on the state portrait in developing performance outcomes for those competencies across grade levels. So we have performance outcomes at 2nd grade, at 5th grade, at 8th grade, at 12th grade that say a 2nd grader who's a collaborator we should see these things, as opposed to a 5th grader who's a collaborator. So, and all that's there for is for resource. It's not intended for you to say you have to do it this way. But I think that at the end of the day, people are going to take a deep breath and realize that the state portrait that has been approved by the state board doesn't look very much different than the portraits most of them have. They may have added things to it. They may have named things differently. But at the end of the day, if you laid all of the things that those competencies have in them out in one big long list, their portrait is going to probably look a lot like the state board's portrait. And so, and that was the intent, is to say, here's something that we know everybody, because that's what's happening. It's true in the L3s. They're showing us that that's a really important part of what they want to be held accountable for, is that local set of competencies. And please don't make us do different competencies, which we're not. We just want to be there to support your work in valuing that accountability that you want for your kids through your portrait. Sarah, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
I don't think so, David. I think that addresses it well.
Thank you. I think Sarah got frozen up there for a bit. Glad you're able to rejoin us. So I think we'll draw the panel to a close now. We're almost to the end of our time. Maybe we could move to the next slide and ask folks to put in the chat, what connections are you finding between the story of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the story of work in your community and your state? And is there anything that you heard that would make you curious to learn more? If you could put that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I just really want to thank David and Sarah, who've been such tremendous leaders and thought partners for a process that is just emerging, and taking the risk along with their tremendous leader, Jason Glass, to be kind of at the top of and the center of an emerging process, that all the answers may not all be there when they got started. So I just want to thank you for sharing your thoughts about this today. And I also want to thank Gretchen for supporting us with the slides and all of the presentations and what have you. I did want to also note the next slide, if you will, Gretchen, that there is a 1-minute poll that we'll need to link into the chat. And if you could finish that before you leave, we'd appreciate it. I think Gretchen did that. Very good. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.